So there are cessationists that have some decent arguments that are worth a second examination, but I know for sure of one cessationist argument that really needs to be put to bed. This is one of the worst, silliest arguments against the continuation of the gifts that exist, and I want to show you why today. So I don't want to assume anything when it comes to this area of cessationism and continuationism. So I'll just provide quick definitions so that it makes sense as I talk through the video. The idea of cessationism is the idea that, or the belief that all sign, miraculous, or revelatory supernatural gifts ceased after the apostles, and they are not to be of use in today's church. And then you have the continuationists, who is the belief, who lives under the belief that the gifts have never ceased, and that they're not only available but meant to be a normative expression of everyday church today. Now, there's usually a lot of talk about cessationism and continuationism this time of year, because this tends to be the time of year whenever John MacArthur will do his Strange Fire conference, and there was an announcement recently about a movie called Cessationist or Cessationism that is specifically kind of the culmination of all of these conferences and all of that, and this whole line of thought that the trailer was launched, and there's supposed to be a coinciding conference in October of next year with the launch of this documentary, and so on and so forth. And honestly, I don't know a ton of details about it, and I don't really need to know a ton of details about it because the arguments haven't changed in 30, 40 years. So the talk is growing quite a bit, and this tends to be just a hot topic at the moment. It's a topic that I'm actually quite passionate about in this kind of realm, but I try not to be antagonistic really to anyone in the body. I really try not to be antagonistic. I really try to argue based on the validity of arguments and not do character assassination or anything like that. I cannot say the same, honestly, for the people on the other side, on the cessationism side. Not all of them are like this, but there are many that would argue that if you are a charismatic, there's no way you're even saved. And so I would actually be damned to hell and not be saved and not know Jesus at all, due to the fact that I am a charismatic. And I honestly, I hold no such view towards a cessationist. I don't believe that a cessationist is not saved or anything like that. And I think that, and I wouldn't obviously say that about John MacArthur. And I think that John MacArthur actually has some good teachings on many different issues that I've even listened to before. But I will say specifically about this issue, he is particularly plainly accusatory and mean-spirited on this issue, and mean-spirited not in a mamby-pamby grow a pair kind of way, like I just need to get over it, but mean-spirited in a sense that it actually appears to be, for me, opposite to the spirit of Jesus. This is not just confrontation, but this is constant character assassination to anyone who believes in the charismatic expression in church. So I'm not going to really necessarily talk about these people and really dive into all the stuff that they believe and all the mean things and whatever it is. That's not really why I'm here. I want to set all of that aside for a second, and I want to specifically talk about the silliest, worst cessationist argument that exists. And I want to actually attack the argument and not the people. And to be fair, many cessationists don't even use this argument any longer because the validity of it has been just completely, it just doesn't hold any weight. But there are cessationists that still use this argument. But I mean, if we can just put this thing to rest for good, if we can just kill this thing for good, because this is probably the worst argument that exists against the continuation of the gifts. And it is this whole argument that because now that we have love, based on 1 Corinthians 16, now that we have love, we have no need of signs, and because we have the scripture, we have no need of signs. So the idea being out of 1 Corinthians 13, that because we have love, we've actually matured from the need for signs, and that the perfect that 1 Corinthians 13 refers to is the canonization of Scripture. Now, you don't actually have to look very far to recognize that this is actually not a smart argument. This makes no sense whatsoever, because as 1 Corinthians 13 ends, following that, if you went down that line of argumentation, then 14:1 absolutely makes no sense whatsoever, which is literally telling you immediately after all of that to pursue these gifts, to pursue these spiritual gifts, but especially that you may prophesy. Why on God's green earth would Paul say that, you know what, once the scripture comes and once you actually have love, now that we have love, we have no need for gifts? Why would he then go, now pursue gifts? Right? It makes no sense. And honestly, the idea of canonization of scripture coming into play at all, there is nowhere on that page, there is nowhere in that arena that you can possibly come to that conclusion unless you bring in a separate opinion. It would make no sense for Paul to say, well, now that you've matured in love, and once you have mature love, don't worry about these gifts anymore, and especially once you have the scripture, once the scripture's canonized, then you won't need these gifts. It wouldn't make any possible logical sense. It would make no sense whatsoever for Paul to say that and then immediately go, now pursue these gifts. It doesn't make any sense. So let's actually read the passage itself and just look at what it says. Okay? It says in 1 Corinthians 13, starting in verse 8, love never fails, but if there are gifts of prophecy, they will be done away. And here's what we have to say. All of us will be cessationist at some point, and I'll tell you why. They will be done away. If they are tongues, they will cease. If there is knowledge, it will be done away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will be done away. When I was a child, I used to speak like a child, think like a child, reason like a child. When I became a man, I did away with childish things. For now we see in a mirror dimly, which is the time that's talking about, right? Right now. But then face to face, the beatific vision, face to face. For now I know in part, but then I will know fully, just as I also have been fully known, which is that moment when we see Jesus face to face. Face to face. But now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. It is pretty well understood beyond a shadow of a doubt that when the perfect comes, unless you're going to go with the cessationist argument that says that somehow, in some way, that refers to the scripture, when the perfect comes is referring to the second coming of Christ. When the perfect comes. In other words, it is absolutely silly for us to think that once Jesus steps on the scene, we're going to continue to operate in these spiritual gifts because we'll be looking at the gift. I will not see Jesus face to face when he comes back and I'll go, all right, it's time for me to prophesy. That's absolutely silly. We will all be cessationists. There will be no need for the gifts whenever Jesus returns. But until he returns, there was never meant to be a stoppage to the gifts. When they cease, right, it will cease because you don't need the gifts when you are looking at the gift. And the funny thing about this is that many of the cessationists actually will argue, that to believe in the sign gifts, to believe in revelatory gifts, to believe in them actually undercuts the sufficiency of Scripture and the authority of Scripture. But I will tell you, it is actually precisely because of the sufficiency and the authority of Scripture that I believe that these gifts are to continue until Jesus comes, because that's the most logical conclusion that you can come to from reading that passage. You would actually have to undermine the authority and sufficiency of Scripture to come to the conclusion that when the perfect comes means the canonization of Scripture, because there is no reference to that whatsoever. You would actually have to import an idea outside of the Scriptures into the reading of the Scriptures to be able to come to the conclusion that when the perfect comes actually refers to the canonization of Scripture, because it is just simply not there. It would have to come from somewhere else. In other words, I think that by all means, I'm sure that there's better arguments that cessationists can make, at least, appealing to the Scriptures in some way, some form. But I will say, in this case, this is absolutely not it. It is absolutely silly to try to argue that this passage is talking about the canonization of Scripture, and then out of the same mouth say that continuationists are undermining the authority and sufficiency of Scripture when you absolutely have to look to a different source to be able to come to that conclusion. I know there are better arguments out there that exist. I don't agree with them, but I know there are better arguments that exist. If you start using the 1 Corinthians 13 argument against continuationism, I'm sorry, but you lose all credibility. This one absolutely cannot work. Let's look at better arguments. Let's argue on better ground than this, because you literally cannot come to this conclusion just by reading the passage on its own. There's other arguments that exist, and we can go to that territory, but this one, let's just kill this one for good, because it definitely does not make any sense, and it definitely does not work.